Extinction is a really tough map. From scarce resources to harsh conditions, there's a lot of challenges being thrown your way. In this video, I'll share 30 very detailed tips and tricks I've learned from my 1,000+ hours of playing on Extinction, and by the end of the video, you'll know everything you need to know to be a pro of one of Ark's toughest maps. As always, if I forget something or you disagree, please comment it down below. On a side note before I start, as of recording this, I'm at about 4,100 subs. If you could sub to help me hit my goal of 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year, I'd greatly appreciate it. I'll order the tips in a way that goes from early game tips to late game, just so it's a little bit easier to follow, and I'm also going to have a lot of video chapters on the bottom, so if you want to come back to this video later or just skip around now to the stuff you need, feel free to do so. Without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy my full guide to playing Ark Extinction Ascended. Alright, so the first tip is just how to choose the starting biome for you to begin your playthrough. So this varies on a biome to biome basis, but there's never really a reason to choose the desert. Obviously, if you want to, you can. It's not horrible, but there's no specific reason to choose it over the other three. The first real area that I would suggest is the sunken forest. If you want a chill area with low risk and you don't really care about progressing through the game super optimally, the sunken forest is a very good pick for that. Although the resource and creature variety is pretty limited, and actually getting out of the sunken forest and making it to the rest of the map is definitely difficult if you start here, I would recommend it if you're trying to take things slow. The Sanctuary is probably the correct pick for about 75% of players. It's a great middle ground between not being too dangerous but offering you a lot of valuable resources that you'll need throughout the entire run. It gives the player access to a lot of flyers, it gives access to the Enforcer, which is a really good early game creature, so yeah, it's definitely a good pick. The final option is the snow biome, and for more advanced players, I'd probably recommend this. I'd probably do a no run in the Sanctuary, kill yourself, respawn in the snow biome and start there, because getting an early game snow owl allows you to access the entire map super easily. This is due to its really powerful healing ability, which lets you overcome the really detrimental Wasteland harsh conditions. So yeah, I would definitely recommend starting in the snow biome if you're very experienced on the map, because it just gets you off to a really nice start. Okay, so tip number 2 is just going to be a note run in general. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to speed up my path really quickly throughout the entire thing, and I'm going to give coordinates on screen whenever I hit one of the notes. This is so if you're spawning in, you can't follow it if you're on a slower speed, but also if you've already been playing the map, you can go back to these notes now and get a boost of XP for your character or just a good amount of XP for a creature. For the start of the run, you want to spawn at Sanctuary East and start at the Coliseum. Once you do the first few, you jump off and respawn in Sanctuary West, where you're going to want to respawn a few times until you get spawning near the green obelisk. Once you spawn around the green ob, then you can finally get the second half of this run, which is also shown here, and yeah, you just want to run through this. A couple things to note about the run. The last 4 are pretty optional, especially if you're on single player where all the notes are 4x XP, but on official servers, you're going to need all of these to get around level 70 after you finish it, which is pretty much the goal for an XP run. There are other guides online for these runs, of course, but it's very important to get early levels on this map especially, so I figured I'd include it here. For the last 3 notes, you'll run into Aranios pretty often. Make sure to be careful of those because when you're just on foot with nothing on you, Aranios can really screw you with those webs. In the entire rest of the run, there's really no other specific points where danger is a big concern, just because the Sanctuary is a pretty safe area in general. One more tip I'd like to give for these note runs is make sure to be picking up bushes the entire way as you're running through them. Grab stim berries and make sure those are being used the entire time so you don't run out of stam, because if you run out of stam and you have no items on you, you're very susceptible to danger, even though there's not much of it. Again, I understand that it's very hard to follow. I'd recommend putting this at 0.25x speed if you're trying to run along with it, and I hope it is helpful. My third tip is what I call the Tricky Resources Guide. I'm simply going to go through the entire map's resource list, and anything that isn't blatantly obvious how to farm is something that I will tell you the best way to farm. Up first, let's talk about oil. There's 2 ways to go about farming oil on this map: the safe way and the fun way. The safe way is to go to the snow biome at 1570 approximately and enter this lake. There's a lot of oil nodes at the bottom and pretty much nothing that's going to endanger you here besides Sarcos. The fun way is to go to approximately 8535 in the Wasteland and farm the oil rocks there. There's a higher abundance of oil rocks, which is higher reward, but there are corrupted Paraceratheriums and corrupted Spinos here, so it is much more dangerous. It also is in the Wasteland, which is significantly harder to deal with than being in the snow biome. For polymer, simply kill corrupted creatures and get the corrupted nodules from them. This acts as polymer and it's way easier than farming organic polymer from penguins, mantis, or OSDs, but you never really need specifically organic polymer, so I would just stick with the corrupted creatures. To get honey most effectively, just simply fly around on a snow owl with the heat vision enabled in the Sanctuary or the sunken forest, and you'll be able to see the beehives really easily. In Extinction Ascended, this is an especially important resource for this map because of the new Blade Wasp Hive turret. For black pearls, the best method is absolutely to make a gacha farm for it, but if you're not able to do that, the only other way to do it is to farm high tier corrupted creatures like gigas, wyverns, and rexes. But yeah, for black pearls, gachas are definitely the way to go. If you don't know how to make a gacha farm yet for a certain resource, stick around, I'll be covering that later in the video. Beaver dams are one of the best ways to farm silica pearls, cementing paste, rare flowers, and rare mushrooms. Beaver dams spawn in the rivers and lakes all across the map, from the snow biome to the sanctuary all the way down to the sunken forest. Another good way to get silica is just to farm the silicate rocks that spawn in the forbidden zone on the top of the map, and for the cementing paste you can also use acatinas. And both rare flowers and rare mushrooms are very easily attainable from the purple flowers in the desert biome as well. The last resource I'll talk about in this section is obsidian. Obsidian spawns absolutely everywhere in the sulfur and oil areas in the bottom left of the wasteland, and it is scattered across the rest of the map if you can't get to this dangerous area, but I would recommend going here if you're trying to get a big farm of it. Tip 4 is about how you can make element imbued gasoline with ease. The two new resources you need for this are the fragmented green gems and congealed gas balls. Luckily, once you know how to get these, they're very abundant on the map, so it's pretty easy. In the sulfur field at 7030 on the map, there's a high quantity of sulfur rocks that can be mined with a hatchet for a huge amount of condensed gas. Once you smelt down this condensed gas in a forge, you get the congealed gas balls that you're looking for. For the green gems, simply go to the coordinates 6048 or 1895. They're very abundant in these two areas. At 1895, it's in the snow pre-built structure, and at 6048, it's just abundant in the sanctuary in this area. Once you have an abundance of these two resources, making the element imbued gasoline and having access to the DLC content is a breeze. Acatina farms are a great way to get cementing paste on every map, but they're even better on Extinction for two reasons. The first is that gachas will automatically pick up acatina paste off the floor and they won't eat it. To make this work, you need to have the acatina and the gacha on wandering. The acatina needs to be on wandering so it can produce the paste, and the gacha needs to be on wandering so it can actually go pick it up. Another nice feature from this is that having these two together is much more space efficient for all your passive farmers to be in the same place. The second and more obvious reason why acatina farming is really important on this map is because cementing paste on this map is a pain in the ass to farm. There's simply not enough beaver dams on the map to support that being the only way you're farming cementing paste, and nobody, I mean nobody, wants to manually craft cementing paste. So yeah, get yourself an acatina farm, get some gachas to wander around, and it's really space efficient and worthwhile. Enforcers are one of the best early game mounts in the entirety of Ark, so let's talk about how to get them as early as possible. 3 out of the 5 required resources to craft the Enforcer are in an absolute surplus in the Sanctuary from the lampposts and the benches. The only two tricky ones are Polymer and Oil. Here's how I would go about getting these in the early game. For the Polymer, just farm weak corrupted creatures in close proximity to the Sanctuary so you don't need to get the Wasteland debuff, but still have access to those creatures. For the oil, I would opt to go into the snow biome for this section to just go into the lake I talked about earlier in the video. The reason for this is you don't need that much oil for this craft. The primitive only needs 20 oil, and the Enforcer BPs don't require that much more, so you can get enough oil from the snow biome, and it's way safer than deep wasteland for early game progression. High tier Enforcers are a huge boost and definitely worth it if you want to use the Enforcer in the early game OSDs and element bands. Killing high level Enforcers gets the best chance of a good blueprint because you don't need to worry about both the XP level and the tier of the blueprint. You cannot control the RNG of the tier of the blueprint ever, but killing high level Enforcers ensures that when you do get lucky and get a high tier, the blueprint is actually worth crafting because the Enforcer isn't level 20. In the clip in the background, I get an apprentice blueprint, which is actually pretty lucky. The problem is the level is so low that it's still not even worth making this, even though we did get a pretty good roll here. The next few tips are going to be all about the gacha. The reality with the gacha is it's one of the strongest things on the map if you know how to use it, but most people just don't know how to. First, I'm just going to review how the gacha works and how the drop system works, and then I'll get into how to optimize every facet of gachas so you can get the best output possible. Gachas have two types of drops, normal crystals and high tier crystals. Normal crystals give raw resources, and the resources that it gives are chosen at random on a gacha to gacha basis, each gacha coming with 3 common, 2 uncommon, and 1 rare resource. On screen now you can see a table of how each resource in the gacha pool is classified so you know which are the most common to get versus which are the hardest to get. To get a specific resource, you simply have to tame a bunch of gachas or breed for a bunch of gachas and pray for the role you're looking for. Resources are not passed down through breeding. For example, breeding 2 element dust gachas will not guarantee to give you a 3rd element dust gacha, so you really are going to have to play this by chance. The only way to guarantee transferring the resources that a certain gacha has is by cloning it. I'll get into way more detail about how to optimize the resources and even the higher tier drops in a later point, but for now, here's the drop table for the higher tier crystals. These drops are universal for all gachas. Obviously, the tier of the item will vary based on how optimal you are, and I'll get into that in a few seconds here. The first step to maximizing a gacha farm is to optimize the leveling. Leveling crafting skill leads to higher tiers of the pre-crafted items from gacha drops being given on a more regular basis. The crafting skill stat also grants the player more resources per basic crystal from the gacha, so it's very crucial you have this upgraded very well. Alright, now that you know the basics, let's talk numbers here. 150% crafting skill is the bare minimum you want on your gachas, and it eventually stops being worth upgrading around 260% because of the extremely diminishing returns from upgrading it any further than this. Once you hit 260% crafting skill or so, I would recommend just pumping weight afterwards so it can hold more items, so it can eat more, and so it can grab the Achatina paste when it's being passively farmed with the Achatinas like I mentioned earlier in the video. Another really important part of gacha farms is what you feed them, because it's very specific to the gacha and it's also extremely crucial. The gacha needs two types of food for it to be able to produce crystals. The first is a fecal matter of some sort, and the second is a certain type of structure. To start off simple, you want to be using snow owl pellets over any type of feces when it comes to feeding the gachas this type of food. It's just way better and easier to get because snow owls are so abundant on this map. In terms of structures, there's a couple of viable options. Stone is really easy to feed it for high quantities of loot, but the quality just isn't great, so I would recommend using plant species Y traps. Plant species Y is generally the best thing to feed gachas for the best quantity of investment to quality of rewards ratio. On this map, you get plant species Y in the purple bushes in the desert. I just think it's easier to get plant Y farmed up than getting war maps to be fed. It's just the quantity of the war maps is a lot of loot, and Extinction is pretty scarce for resources. You can definitely go with war maps as there's nothing wrong with that decision, but I personally just side with the plant Y. The last tip I'm going to give you for the gachas is how to make an automatic farm, or at least as close to automatic as physically possible. To start off this chain of commands, start with the snow owl. They drop snow owl pellets, which are very convenient for gachas, and the gachas will automatically pick up the pellets if they're in a close proximity to the owl. If the gacha already has stone, plant Y, war maps, or other structures on it, it will automatically take that pellet and then create a crystal with it because it has everything it possibly needs. After it creates the crystal, have a Pegamastix behind the gacha, and that will pick up the crystal, which is really nice as well, because the Pega picking up the crystal makes the entire process automatic, meaning you don't have to stay at your base to pick up these crystals. You can let it farm for you while you're out doing other things. One important thing that I should note here is that Pegamastix actually being a high level is pretty important for this automatic farm. The thing is, the higher the level the Pegamastix is, the bigger the range of pickup it has for the crystals, so making it higher level will mean you don't need as many Pegamastix in the farm to make it work. These three creatures working together in a synergized fashion makes a really nice automatic gacha farm for crystals, and I use this in every single playthrough I do. These three creatures plus the Achatina make really nice automatic farms for your game, and they all seamlessly work together, so why not? My next three tips will be how to make really effective traps for three of Extinction's best creatures. The first design I want to show off is for a trap for the snow owl. I want to give credit to the trap to Furious11. I will link his guide down below. To make this trap, you need 4 stone pillars, 2 stone quarter foundations, 3 stone walls, and 1 stone door. Just place the trap as demonstrated on screen now. It's a little bit tricky, but once you look at it once, it's pretty easy. The biggest tip I have for using this trap effectively is do not place the door in a way that you need to guide the owl downhill into the door. It just doesn't work. The owl will fly over the trap. If you're guiding the owl uphill into this trap, it is pretty much foolproof. You just run through, you close the door behind it. It's very safe. The reason I recommend this design as opposed to the basic gateways and gates is because it's a lot cheaper and more minimalistic, and because this trap confines the movement of the snow owl more and closes quicker because the basic door closes a lot faster than the big gate. So yeah, with the caveat of bringing the owl downhill not working for the trap very effectively at all, it's a really great trap. The next creature I'm going to show you how to tame is the Velonasaur. And this one is a ridiculously easy method. I actually couldn't believe this when I saw it. Full credit for finding this idea goes to Captain Fat Dog. I'll link his guide down below as well. For this method, simply place a quarter foundation below your feet. It doesn't matter if it's thatch or tech, then place 3 quarter walls surrounding that foundation. After you do that, simply go shoot the Velonasaur that you want to tame with whatever you're trying to knock it out with, then go box yourself in like you see here on the screen and just knock out the creature. The Velonasaur simply cannot hit you if you're inside of a quarter foundation with 4 quarter walls surrounding it. It is hilarious that this works. It is literally so easy that it's not even funny. If I had to give you more advice on top of this, don't shoot the Velonasaur when it's super far away too many times because it's kind of hard to angle it so you get the crank to go over the wall and actually hit the creature. But it'll literally walk up to you and stand on top of you so you can't miss. So just save the ammo for when it actually gets closer to you. The last creature I'm going to teach you how to tame is the Managarmr. This trap requires 4 large bear traps or plant species Y traps and 2 to 4 stone or metal gates. Credit for this trap goes to Teacher's Game 2. I'll link that video in the description as well. Once you find the Managarmr you want to tame, place 4 large bear traps in a square around you, or do this with plant species Y, it's the same thing. Once the mana dive bombs you and gets hit by the trap, simply place stone or metal gates around it to trap it inside. You need to place one in front of its front 2 arms, and you need to place one behind those, and it will not be able to fly out after that. You place more for assurance, but you really only need 2 technically. Make sure to disable snapping when you do this, or it will screw you over. As you can see in this demonstration, me messing up because of this didn't even matter. I was simply able to place another bear trap down and do it again. This really is a pretty foolproof method. The only challenge, of course, is the extremely buggy AI the mana has on official servers specifically, and there's not really a trap that can fix a mana from skyboxing itself when it gets a little angry, so I can't really help you there. Navigating the Wasteland in the early game of Extinction is important, but can prove to be a really big challenge if you're not ready for it. Here's all the debuffs and how they work, and how to combat it most effectively. The Wasteland is super hot and has a huge amount of aggressive creatures. On the bright side, corrupted creatures are weaker than the regular versions of those creatures, but this doesn't really help much, especially when you're in the early game and can't kill them anyway. The other problem with the Wasteland is that your hunger drains ridiculously fast, and the heat is basically unstoppable without ghillie armor, so you really have little options when it comes to early game traveling. This sucks, especially because most of the best farming areas in the Wasteland are in the far outskirts of the map, so it takes a lot of traveling to go back and forth to get there, and it's pretty much impossible to do, unless you use a snow owl. I recommend flying the snow owl around in the Wasteland, especially in the early game, for a couple of reasons. One is that it's fast and has a high weight stat, so you can actually get farm out of it. 2 is because it has good stats, so you can kill a lot of these weaker corrupted creatures, yet again, they are weakened because they're corrupted. 3 is because of the snow owl's high speed, so you can actually traverse a lot of the map quickly. And 4, and most importantly, being the fact that it can heal you, so if you are getting low in the Wasteland because of whatever reason, there's many reasons it could be, you can heal yourself back up and keep yourself protected because you're frozen over, and then go travel again once you're back to full health. Until you unlock and craft ghillie armor, this is pretty much the only option for long extended periods of time traveling in the Wasteland. Speaking of long distance travel, that works a little bit differently too on Extinction compared to every other map. The best pack mules are the Gasbags and the Snow Owl, just because they're faster than RGs and have really good weight stats. Sure, you can't carry creatures with these two, so you can't go on large farming runs with it in that sense, but it's a really great option to bring a Gasbags or a Snow Owl for anything you're going to manually farm, or even if you're just trying to traverse the map or transport resources from an OSD back to your base. There's a lot of applications here, and I would not recommend using an RG or a Quetzal for them because they're too slow. Another really quick tip is make sure to use an Equus if you're trying to tame something from the Wasteland. I'd highly recommend using the lasso on the Equus to bring the creature that's in the Wasteland out of it into either one of the domes or into the sanctuary. It just makes taming it so much safer, so much easier. The problem in the Wasteland is twofold. The first issue to consider is obviously everything is hostile, so there's way more things to worry about, and there's flying hostile creatures so they can fly over your spike traps. The second issue is that every corrupted creature can break structures, so your creature that you're trying to tame is just never safe when it's unconscious in the Wasteland. Before I move on fully from the topic of the Wasteland, there's one more thing I want to talk about, which is the events. Coming from Evolved, the meteor shower and the drops falling normally are basic Wasteland events that pretty much everybody knows how to deal with by now, but I will go over them briefly. For the meteor shower, just get into a dome. You absolutely do not want to get pelted by a meteor, and it really isn't too hard to avoid if you just get into one of the 2 domes or go into the sunken forest. If you don't make it there and you're in the sanctuary, it's not perfectly safe to just stand under something that's above you because the meteors fall on an angle, they don't fall directly straight down from the sky. With that being said, if you're not flying around above the sanctuary and begging to get hit by a meteor, you're probably not going to because there's so many structures in the sanctuary, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. For OSDs falling, just know where they are and go check it out. OSDs can become way easier depending on the environment surrounding it. For example, if you're on a hill and there's a lot of upward elevation going up to your OSD from all sides, it becomes a lot easier to defend it because you can knock things back down the hill. This isn't anything game changing, but it's definitely something to think about. The third event that can happen is the King Titan can now randomly spawn in the Wasteland. You're able to see where the King Titan is on the map, so just avoid him. He's absurdly OP, demands heavy progression to be able to be beaten, and it's much tougher to deal with him in the Wasteland, even though his stats are weaker because you can't prep for it. For example, if you're going to fight the King Titan in his arena, you can just bring the Dreadnoughtus out ahead of time, bring the Titans there ahead of time, have everything ready to go. If he spawns in the Wasteland randomly, however, it's just not as easy to get set up and to fight him. If you are prepared to fight him, there are some nice perks though. You get custom cosmetics, and you get a world buff which lasts for a pretty long time. I couldn't get an exact number from researching, but it is a pretty substantial time, so it definitely is worth it. There is some merit to fighting him, but don't do it unless you're extremely prepared. With the Wasteland stuff out of the way, let's talk about OSDs. First, I'll go over every difficulty tier and when you should tackle them in progression. Blue and yellow OSDs are doable in the early to mid game, and they reward the player with a notable amount of resources and pre-crafted items that cap out at 300% for the blue OSDs and 320% for the yellow OSDs. Red and purple OSDs are hard and demand late game creatures and thorough planning to take on. they drop a surplus of useful items as well as pre-crafted items that cap out at 550% and 600% respectively. There is a massive tier gap between the first two tiers and the last two tiers of the OSDs. Being able to complete the red and the purple tiers means you are ready for the late game items. Knowing when to target these OSDs is just as important as actually doing them though, so let's get into that. For the sake of this video, I'm going to talk about how to beat the OSDs as a solo player. If you're playing with more than one person, these strategies still work and they're just easier to execute because you have more people helping out with them. If you ride on a good enforcer that does 4 times damage to the corrupted creatures and is fast, as well as bring along a few Rexes, Spinos, Theries, or other pretty strong creatures, the blue and yellow OSDs should be a pretty easy task. For the red and purple OSDs, use a Dino Leash with very strong Karchas. This will keep the Karchas in close proximity to the drop to defend it, which definitely gives you the best chance of succeeding at this really difficult OSD. Also make sure to have creature harvesting turned off for the Karchas. You simply do not have time for the Karchas to go and harvest the hundreds of corpses that it's creating during these defenses. With that being said, make sure to feed the Karchas in between the waves so you can still fill up the rage meter, because when it's not full on food, the rage meter doesn't work as well from what I've seen. Now, to be clear, these OSDs are simply not designed for a solo player, so even with this optimized strategy, you will fail sometimes, but stick with it. You'll definitely beat these OSDs with a couple of tries and a little bit of practice, and yet again, the area the OSD spawns in does matter sometimes. Sometimes the area is just really tough to defend, sometimes it's open to way too much, sometimes you're on top of a hill and it's a little bit easier. So definitely keep trying, you got this. Now that we're done with the OSDs, let's talk about element veins. First, let's talk about the element vein difficulties. Element veins come in 3 difficulty tiers: easy, medium, and hard. To determine what the element vein's difficulty is, go to the core vein of the element vein and see how much HP it has. If it has 10k HP, it's an easy element vein. If it has 25k HP, it's a medium element vein. And if it has 50k HP, it's a hard element vein. The easy element vein is comparable to a blue OSD in terms of difficulty, the 25k is comparable to a yellow OSD, and a 50k is comparable to a red OSD. The lower difficulty veins do give less element, but they are much easier to handle for weaker creatures, so it's a great option for the early game. With the difficulties and rewards out of the way, let's get into strategies. Managarmrs are a great choice for the element veins because the breath doesn't damage the vein. The Enforcer is also a great choice because of its high speed, 4x damage to corrupted creatures, and low AoE on its attacks, so you can make sure again that you're not damaging the vein during the defense. Damaging the vein during the defense means you get less reward at the end, so you really want to avoid that at all costs. In terms of good support creatures for your mount, I would recommend Karchas, followed by Gigas, Rexes, Spinos, and Theries, in that order. The thing is, you need one of these absolute monsters to help you defend the element veins because these things can get really tough, but you also don't want them damaging your vein, so you want to keep them as far away from the vein as possible while still having them in an area where they kill the attacking creatures. My advice for this would be just to send these creatures out and leave them on aggressive. They'll attack everything out there and they'll never be drawn back to the center of the element vein because you'll be dealing with anything that slips through the cracks. The optimal setup in my opinion is to bring a mana on the mount and then have Karchas or maybe Gigas for the higher tier element veins. For the lower tiers, you can get away with using lower tier stuff like I mentioned earlier, but for the higher tiers, you're really going to want the optimal setup. One more tip is to reel back in these outer creatures you're using like the Gigas or the Karchas in between the waves so they don't get too carried away and run all the way away from your vein and stop being useful. Once you successfully defended your element vein, make sure to farm the outer layers of the vein first before farming the core so you get the most element reward for your work. Speaking of element, I found a way to tame the Dreadnoughtus that actually saves a lot of element, and nobody's really talking about it, so I wanted to show it off here. Normally during the Dreadnoughtus taming process, you need to bait the Dreadnoughtus towards an element vein by dropping a few elements as a trail on the way there, and then once it gets there, you feed it a final element to begin the taming process. While this is still the most time-efficient way to tame the Dreadnoughtus and will give you the highest taming efficiency, there is actually an alternative method that I think is pretty interesting and saves a lot of resources. If you deal enough damage to the Dreadnoughtus, around 10,000 for my testing, the Dreadnoughtus will actually aggro to you without you having to drop any element at all. The best way I found to do this is to just use a Managarmr and breath attack the Dreadnoughtus at the start of the taming process as opposed to baiting it around with element. Once you have dealt the 10,000 damage, continue to drag the Dreadnoughtus to the element bin by spraying it more with the Managarmr whenever it de-aggroes you, and you can get it all the way to the vein without spending a single element. If it does de-aggro you, you can be far enough away with the mana breath to do 0 damage but still re-aggro the Dreadnoughtus as long as the hit marker shows on your screen. Once the Dread is at the vein, drop 1 element to initiate the taming process. This saves multiple element and is fairly consistent. I've also not seen any proof of this actually impacting the taming effectiveness in any significant way because you're doing this prior to the start of the taming process. Once you're strong enough to take on the OSDs and the element veins on the highest tiers, you're super ready for the caves and the titans. First, let's talk about the caves. Extinction has 3 caves, 1 for each titan, and the easiest of the 3 caves is the desert cave by a pretty large margin. Most notable threats in the desert cave are the Capros, Rubble Golems, and the Onyx. My recommendation for the desert cave is simply to hop on the back of a Managarmr and fly through. There's no risk in this cave for the Managarmr because there's no Prolovias or Microraptors, so you're never going to get knocked off it if you just fly through quickly. Megatheriums are also a pretty good option because there's so many bugs, and you can also just use the classics like the Gigas, Karchas, or Rexes to go through it because the cave is so massive that all of these will fit. For the forest cave, the main threats are the Prolovias, Microraptors, Capros, and the Baryonyx, which can all cause really big problems. This cave also comes with a surplus of high-level carnivores that are really ready to kill you, so if you fall off your creature, you will die. This statement can't necessarily be said for the desert. There's a couple areas that are pretty low profile when it comes to creature spawns, but on the forest and the ice cave, you will definitely die if you fall off. With so many threats in this cave, I would not recommend a Managarmr here because if you run out of stamina or you just get knocked off by a Prolovia or a Microraptor, it's all over. I would use a Giga or a Karcha because even if you get stunned, you won't fall off the creature because you'll just get put on the back of the creature just standing up, which is convenient because you're not going to die to everything. And these creatures are strong enough to take on all the huge carnivores in here. The ice cave might be a little bit easier than the forest cave, but the approach is just about the same. Don't get killed by the polar Prolovias or the Capros that spawn. Bring fur for the freezing temperatures. That's honestly the only exception with the ice cave compared to the forest cave. And ride on a Giga or a Karcha because on a Managarmr, you could get just knocked off on the Prolovia and you will die to something immediately. For Extinction's boss fights, I don't think there's anything in the game that's more important than a good mech. In my opinion, riding on a mech is the optimal strategy for every single one of these bosses, with maybe a slight exception for the King Titan, but I'll get into that later. You need to get a really good mech for these fights though, without question. To get higher tier mechs than the basic primitive one, you need to complete red or purple OSDs, which will drop higher tier mech blueprints. It's absolutely crucial to get higher tier mechs for the boss fights, especially the desert fight. One thing you should know on the mech is that the natural healing is really slow, but you can enable auto repairing in the wheel when you access it, which I recommend doing whenever you're not using the mech actively because this is just so much more efficient than waiting for it to heal like 4 HP a second. This does cost a pretty good amount of resources, but at the point of progression when you're using the mech actively, you're not really going to need to worry about that. The most important point for me to bring up during this section is what attachment you should use on the mech for each application. To get this out of the way first, the rocket is just useless. Don't use it. Use the other two. This is not something that's worth investing your time into, your resources into. Skip it. The cannon is the best damage dealing option by far. It can completely wreck almost every creature in the game in a couple of shots, which is just crazy power. I personally use this a lot of the time when I'm farming corrupted hearts in the late game because it's just so cool to use. That being said, it's pretty expensive to use the ammo for this, and especially in the boss fights, I like to bring the shield, which is the other option, because it's just safer to do. The cannon doesn't do enough damage to justify using it over a shield in a situation where you have something like a Giga or a Dreadnoughtus or a Karcha just going ham on the boss. The shield is my personal pick for attachment whenever I play with the mech, and here's why. First and most importantly, the shield gives the mech passive armor, which no other attachment does, and this is huge. Even though the actual active ability on the shield is pretty niche because of the limitations that are placed on it, for example, a creature just being able to straight up walk through the shield, I just think the passive armor, plus the fact that it doesn't cost ammo instead of costing durability, is pretty convenient. It always has value because you're always having armor on the mech, and the mech is strong enough without having the cannon or the rocket for this to be justified. The Desert Titan fight is by far the easiest of the 4 bosses on Extinction, in my opinion. The easiest way to take on this boss is simply to stay on the ground and use a high level mech and shoot it out of the air with the lasers. This definitely can take a while because the Desert Titan isn't always in range for the mech to shoot it, but it's completely foolproof because the mech is literally unkillable when it's on the ground from the Desert Titan's attacks. In terms of taming this, I really wouldn't in PvE. The only purpose for taming Titans in PvE is to use it as a tank for the King Titan fight, and the Desert Titan is literally incapable of tanking most of the King Titan's attacks, so I would just personally skip taming this one. The next easiest Titan is the Forest Titan. The strat here is to simply use a Dreadnoughtus or Giga army and ride a mech in the background. The Forest Titan is able to grab you off a lot of mounts, which is a pain in the ass. The mech is immune to this though, so you definitely want to ride one for this fight especially. The Forest Titan also roots your tames in place temporarily and spawns poisonous trees. To counteract these, you can mount one of the orange Forest Wyverns and flame breath the roots in the trees. Make sure to dismount the mech to go on the Forest Wyvern at a safe distance from the Titan so you don't get pulled in. If you want to tame the Forest Titan, simply shoot the corrupted nodules as you're fighting it on the mech. For the Ice Titan, the exact same army strategy of Dreadnoughtus or Gigas works very well against the boss, and riding a mech in the background is still a good idea even though the Ice Titan can't pull you off of your tames. The Ice Titan does do substantially more damage with his abilities than the Forest or Desert Titan, so the Gigas might work a little bit less effectively here, but if they're spec'd well and they're mutated, you can definitely still use them. And again, just like the Forest Titan, for taming the Ice Titan, you're going to want to sit back on the mech and shoot those corrupted nodules when you see them. For the Gamma and Beta King Titan, use 6 to 10 Dreadnoughtus, bring the Ice Titan and the Forest Titan to tank, and either sit back on a mech or fly around in a tech suit and make sure you avoid all of his attacks. For the Alpha King Titan, just make sure to bring the Mega Mech with you. This thing is absolutely OP, and bring the Ice Titan and the Forest Titan again to tank for you, and this fight will be a breeze in a 3v1. The only thing that I usually die to with this boss fight is one of two things. Either I get hit by a meteor from the sky, which just happens sometimes, or the King Titan will get a funny idea to go on a vacation and try to walk away and then get pulled back to the center. But yeah, these Titans were all way harder before the Dreadnoughtus was added, now they're all pretty straightforward. My final tip is to click the video on screen now, which ranks my top 10 creatures for Extinction. With these two videos combined, you'll be an Extinction pro.